Thank you very much, Carrie. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share with you some research that is a partnered research project with a colleague, Gillian Palan, who is at the Corporate Research Forum in London. And she and I basically in the winter and spring of this year undertook a project looking at the state of the field of talent management. And what I'm going to share with you will be somewhat of an overview of our findings, but I think most importantly, it's the set of perspectives that we took away from our survey of the field in terms of really the most important dynamics that have been unfolding over the last actually several decades of the field and what their implications are for us today. Just so you have a little bit of a sense of what the database or research comes from, Gillian interviewed 42 senior HR officers or talent management officers, a total of 65 thought leaders in the field, which would be people like myself or Peter Capelli or John Boudreau. And then a survey was sent out to the Corporate Research Forum's profit and not-for-profit members. And 231 senior HR officials responded to that survey. So what I'm going to share with you, again, are the kind of big picture implications from this study. And I'm going to begin really with what I thought were in some ways some of the most important findings, which have to do with a very surprising outcome. Of the 231 respondents, only 17% said that their organization was effective at anticipating talent needs. In addition to that kind of surprisingly low number, only 20%, which is not so surprising, are satisfied with their approaches to talent management. So what you see here is basically less than a fifth feel that they're doing a good job in talent management. You should know that the organizations that belong to the Corporate Research Forum are large, complex organizations. So I always say if you're going to find organizations that are doing thoughtful work on talent management, it tends to be in the mid to large size companies or not-for-profit organizations. It tends not to occur in smaller organizations. So in some ways, we're looking at the people who you would expect to find some of the stronger practices in the field. In addition, there was a survey that was conducted 3 years ago of 1,000 Fortune 500 board members, and only 20% said, from their perspective as board members, that their organization was doing a good job at talent management. There was a 2014 Global CEO survey in which 63% of surveys of large, complex organizations were concerned about talent availability. And in a Mercer study looking at global talent trends, 85% of the respondents said that talent management needs an overhaul. So when you look at just this data, which is coming basically from 4 different sources, you have to ask yourself, what is going on? Because basically, while the field has been around for quite some time, there's a general sense that it's actually seriously underperforming. The paradox of this is that there is some Boston Consulting Group research done relatively recently in which they looked at a data pool of 1,200 companies. And again, these would all be primarily large-sized companies. And those who scored highly on talent management and leadership development showed that their revenue growth was 2.5 times faster, and their profit growth was 1.5 times faster than companies who rated their talent management systems weaker. So again, the paradox of this is, while we're dissatisfied, it is clear that highly effective talent management practices do appear to deliver stronger organizational performance. So I kind of sat back with Gillian and we said to ourselves, well, why such disappointing results? Why would we expect this? And basically, I want to go back in history a bit because I think that helps us understand why the field is where it is today. And I would argue, in some ways, the field is in an important state of disrepair. Despite innovations and despite a few organizations doing a world-class job at talent management. So I'm going to do something a little bit surprising. I'm going to go back to the 1950s and 1960s. I'm going to show you a list of the innovations in that set of 2 decades that came out of a group of companies who began to pioneer in talent management. The first was that fast-track programs were created for high-potential managers. This is something we think of as probably a more recent phenomena, but you'll see it actually goes way back into the 1950s, and companies like AT&T, or in those days, the Bell system, had established these programs. Management assessment and training centers were being built in North America and in Europe. So these have been around for quite some time. There were things called white books, which were succession planning for those who were at general management roles who were ready to step into executive roles. So this wasn't succession for the CEO. This was really 2 levels below that. Groups of organizations began to think about assignments at headquarters. So you would be posted at headquarters for 2 years, a chief of staff role, so that you could get a broadening perspective. You get an enterprise view. Global assignments appeared in the 1950s, that promising talent should be sent overseas to open up new markets for us and bring back their insights. And surprisingly, employee engagement surveys first had their origins in the 1950s. We tend to think of them as a product of the 1990s and onwards, but actually they were initiated 6.5 decades ago. So when you look at this list, you say to yourself, my goodness, a lot of what we consider best practices today have actually been around for a very long time. I mentioned the Bell system as one of the principal pioneers. Many of the items which I just listed came out of the Bell system, in large part because of a dynamic which we know all too well today called the organizational man. And you joined a company right out of college or maybe even high school, and basically you built your career there. There was very little mobility, and in return, if you were promising and talented, you methodically moved up the ranks. You were trained inside and you're groomed inside, and this allowed these organizations to build out fairly rich, structured management systems. Another kind of Electric. General Electric actually, today we think of specialized leadership programs. Well, they pioneered a manufacturing leadership program. They were very serious about cross-functional, cross-unit assignments for their high-potential leaders. The Session C, which we know today, actually had its 50s. Workforce succession planning went out 30 years, if you can imagine that today. Actually, we're thinking about, literally, we'd be thinking out today to the 2040 range. So, what happened? Why is it that we got off to such a tremendous start in the 50s and 60s, and yet we paradoxically don't seem to have made dramatic advancements? And many of what we consider the foundations of great talent management really have many, many decades. Well, as we began to think about it, there are kind of 3 important historical waves that actually have been eroding internal. I'll walk us through the 3 waves, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. So the first wave, which is coming really in basically the 1970s. And this is a period where many of you will remember there were the embargoes, and OPEC rises up and it decides to basically exert its power over what are the dominant industrial forces of that era, primarily North America and Europe, Western Europe. And while at first glance it doesn't appear to have too dramatic an impact other than people waiting in line for gas, it's the beginning of new entrants into global enterprise, where the West is no longer dominant as the post-World War II player. It begins subtly with this, but then as you look at this chart here, you'll see that really the 50s and 60s, there's very little global trade, but it begins to ratchet up around 1980. So this period, 70 to really 1990, is wave number one. Wave number one is beginning to slowly erode the power of the established powerhouses like General Motors, as companies like Toyota begin to appear and gain share. What that will begin to lay the groundwork for is important layoffs that will come in the next wave. But the disruption begins in this phase one, where slowly challenges are rising up against the established oligopolies, which have had a stable period of 2 decades in the 50s and 60s. There's another force that's rising up in the 50s and 60s, which is called the professional MBA degree. And now you can go and hire a manager who has been, quote, professionally trained by a graduate business school. This is a very important force because increasingly it says to companies, you may not need to do too much internal training. You can buy a pre-trained manager. You don't need to do too much cross-functional rotation. We will teach them how to think like an enterprise leader. I'm going to show you the growth chart for MBAs. Again, if we think of this wave one as 1970 to 1990, you see that we began around 20,000 graduates. In 1990, we're up to almost 80,000 graduates, and although the chart ends in 2010, we're now up to 180,000 per annum, which means
Jay, sorry to interrupt you. We're hearing a truck or something in the background. Is there any way you could pick up the receiver just for at least a few minutes?
That probably took care of it. So what is happening is with the MBA degree, not only is training slowly being outsourced to professional graduate schools, but what the MBA degree is also doing is it's increasing expectations about mobility. In other words, I have an MBA, and so I may be able to move from one organization to the next, certainly in my early career. So it's one of the first chinks in the loyalty paradigm in the direction of employees to their corporation. This is Alfred Mckenzie, and while he predates the 1970s and 90s, Alfred Mckenzie, he's an economist. He starts a consulting firm which will, by the 70s and 90s, become quite famous, called McKinsey & Company, and their primary focus is strategy consulting. And as the established oligopolies of the 60s begin to be challenged by the new entrants of the 70s and 80s, McKinsey's work becomes very popular, and CEOs struggle to reinvent themselves with new strategies. And really, for the first time in a long time, strategy is outsourced. If you think about it, in the 50s and 60s, the CEO and their executive team would have been the primary strategy decision makers. But suddenly, consulting firms rise up and say, we have talented people who can help you really devise an effective strategy. So this is the beginning of outsourcing of the activity of strategy, which will create important implications later on. The other thing that's happening in this era is the rise of executive headhunters. This is Leslie Korn and Richard Ferry, who basically will begin to build out one of several powerful executive recruiting firms. They start their firm in the 1960s. They both worked for Pete Marwick Mitchell in the accounting firm. And they and some McKinsey partners begin to see opportunities because the CEOs of the large established oligopolies say our people don't seem to be able to implement strategies that we've been given. Wonder if we don't need to bring in external talent. So if you think about it, in a high potential loyalty model, you're a high performer, your ultimate destination is to become an executive. In the 1970s and 80s, we begin to change that paradigm and say, well, you may not be up to the task. We may need an outside executive. And the groundwork laid by headhunting firms in the 70s and 80s begin to get a multiplier effect, as we'll see. And this will begin the outsourcing of talent, whereas up to this point it was the insourcing of talent. What's happening is the world's becoming far more unpredictable, much more competitive. Workforce planning is beginning to be thrown into question. Who can plan out 30 years? Rise of the MBA, which says, you can now buy well-trained managers. The fact that one of the most important roles of senior leaders, strategic thinking, can now be outsourced. And then the groundwork is being laid in this era for executive recruiting and, from our standpoint, mobility at the senior-most levels of an organization. And, of course, as many of you know, this will cascade down into the mid-levels and then into the junior levels in the later decades. Wave number 2 will appear, and this begins really beginning of the 90s and will go all the way through until about literally mid-2000. It really begins with the downsizing of these oligopolies that are so successful in the 60s, 70s, and now their paradigms are challenged. And I just gave you this one example, IBM laying off 250,000 employees and then hiring 100,000 new employees. So not only are we breaking the loyalty paradigm, but we're encouraging a lot of mobility between organizations. As many of you recall, this period, particularly in the 80s and 90s, is a period of a lot of layoffs. And I could go through the list of large corporations who lay off anywhere from 10,000 to 200,000 people. And this is really the beginning of the end of the loyalty paradigm. That is going to also be accompanied by a massive growth in mergers and acquisitions. And I'm showing you this chart, and you can see that 1987, 1986, 1988, we begin to get a growth in mergers, and then it skyrockets in 1999 and 2000. We have a second skyrocket in 2007, 2008. This chart is important because what it's saying is we're going to rationalize, we're going to consolidate industries that are in trouble, which basically during this period, many of the mergers and acquisitions result in more layoffs. So the layoffs have to do with both downsizing, but they also have to do with rationalizing these merged firms. So you can see that the merger acquisition activity continues very strong all the way up to today. What will happen in the last decade, although it began earlier, is that the purpose of mergers and acquisitions will begin to shift to a degree, and in a moment you'll see this in wave 3. But from our standpoint, this is important because the mergers and acquisitions are really breaking the loyalty paradigm officially. Now we also get to see the rise of executive recruiting. And you'll see that executive recruiting has a real steady growth. It will peak briefly in 2000, probably the end of the internet bubble. Then it'll make a resurgence just before the next serious recession, 2007, and then today it's basically grown itself back to its growth curve. This chart is really important because really it's saying that now force that can move talent across industry and across whole industries, different industries. So now we're really seeing in the second wave, the lubricant for movement. The firms, of course, building large databases. They knew a lot about the individuals. Korn Ferry was one of the pioneers in computer databases. They kept good track of who you were, where you were, and they offered greater opportunity for you. You didn't have to stay more than a few years in a firm if you were a high potential person. Also coming in the second wave is the internet bubble. And some of you will remember this is the era where all of a sudden younger people are jumping from consumer goods companies like a Coca-Cola or a PepsiCo or a Procter & Gamble, and they're wanting to get rich and they're wanting to be an entrepreneur or work with entrepreneurs. This is a very important period. While it ends in a crash, it will be really an important wave that will reappear today with younger people wanting more of an entrepreneurial opportunity or more of a freelance opportunity. McKinsey, of course, publishes the famous War for Talent at that moment. Suddenly now, talent skyrockets to the top of your CEO's agenda. Oh my gosh, we're losing people. We're losing some of our best and brightest young people. They want to get rich. They want to be in a fun industry. What do we do? And now suddenly, talent management is back in the limelight. It doesn't last very long, but it does go back in the limelight. And this wave is really important because it basically says that talent is now fairly commoditized, and premium talent has lots of runways to go in and out of different organizations. This is really, as many of you can appreciate, the phase where the lifetime employment contract is basically dying. It's really powerfully ending, and if it isn't ending for your parents, you're noticing on your parents' cocktail table a Fortune magazine article which says AT&T sheds 70,000 people, and you remember that your uncle worked for AT&T, and you ask your parents what happened to him, and they say he was laid off. So as a young person, you're starting to think, not so sure I want to find a lifetime job. So we're beginning to see disillusionment with large companies, in large part because of the internet bubble. And with the rise of executive recruiting, the talent mobility is really starting to accelerate. In the third wave, we're going to see some even more powerful accelerators. So what's happening is internally, organizations are in some ways moving their focus away from internal talent management to outsourcing talent management by buying and selling talent. So that's why this is really important. And some of the most talented people at the very senior levels are being brought from the outside. I'm called the white knights, who somehow are going to implement this strategy that will reorient our organization to adapt. So this leads us to where we are today, which really begins around the mid-2000s. One of the most important forces, and it began earlier than the mid-2000s, but it begins to really be felt, is outsourcing, where increasingly accounting work is now done off to India. So our accounting department now, while we have individuals here in North America, there's a large group who work for us in India through an outsourced firm. So entire functions are starting to move outside the organization. They're no longer employees, they're contractors or they're freelancers. So outsourcing actually then is particularly important from our standpoint because this is specialized talent, tends to be at mid-low levels of professional talent. but it's the kind of death knell in terms of why would we need to develop internal talent when we can just buy it in a contracted form. I'm showing you Google's acquisitions. These are the 10 largest private company acquisitions by Google, and I mentioned that while we continue to have a merger and acquisition force, more and more of the acquisitions, particularly coming out of the tech space, are about acquiring talent. So we're buying knowledge workers. And as you can see from this list of Google acquisitions, this is about buying people who have specialized knowledge in areas that Google needs to expand. So now acquisitions, again, this would have been somewhat the case, but it's really accelerated today. Acquisitions are about buying entire companies of talent. It's not going to look for one executive. We're going to literally, Cisco in some ways is one of the most important forerunners of this era, where they build much of the company around acquired firms with a specialized expertise. I'll bet you everybody on this call is on LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn is important because it continues the mobility. It's another lubricator of mobility. Some of you may or may not know, but the executive recruiting firms were some of the early investors in this. And it's really a marvelous tool because you update for the world your information. In the old days, executive recruiters had to do the best job they could assembling information on you. Now you do that job for them. And by the way, because you want your LinkedIn page to look impressive, you update it and you do your best to make it look good. And increasingly, this vehicle becomes your source of branding. Tom Peters, many years ago, wrote an article entitled, You Are Your Brand. Well, LinkedIn allows you to have a billboard space for your brand. Younger people use lots of other vehicles for branding related to social media. But this has become a very important place as a repository of talent. The other thing that's happening is, and I just cite Glassdoor, because increasingly what's happening is that people are rating your organizations just as they would a vacation on TripAdvisor. These ratings now, it's hard to know how much weight they're carrying yet. I mean, I'm showing you that 48% of job seekers do use Glassdoor. And I will use Glassdoor when I'm doing research on a company to see kind of what is the state of that organization. And you may be aware that there's a rating system. I think it's 1 to 5. And you can go in and you can see individual comments from employees. It's hard to know how many of these are admirers versus naysayers. But I'm going to show you a couple that I just pulled off the web yesterday for us to see today. So one firm, this firm is rated on the 5 scale at about 4.4, which is exceptional. This is a place you and I would want to go to. And I just pulled one of the first comments: great leadership, great benefits, forward thinking. Now, one thing I would say, and you can probably appreciate, is I'm making the assumption that companies increasingly try to manage these reviews. But when you see some of them, you'll say, aha, looks like I'm probably getting either disgruntled people or they're doing a bad job managing. So here's the next one. This is another organization: demanding workload, changes in organizational structure, confusing. Compliance processes are cumbersome and time-consuming. So when you look at that, that's probably not the organization you'd like to take a job at. The next one is even more fun. Somebody said lions led by donkeys. I will say you this one is just below a 3, And pretty consistently, the reviews are negative. I was hard-pressed to find anything higher than a 3, and most were in the 2 range, and a couple were in the 1 range. This is one of my favorite. Executive board are clueless. This is one that is very high scoring. Great workplace environment. Co-workers feel like family, very supportive of each other. This was in about, I think, the 4.3, 4.4 range. This is one that's down in the 2 range. Unfortunately, poor new senior management. People are viewed as commodities. They get to rate the CEO. I can tell you on this one, the CEO is one of the lowest rating scores I've ever seen. And I'll tell you the one that's great workplace environment, that is one of the highest rated CEOs I've seen on Glassdoor. So these are really important because increasingly, this will be one source that talent will check out. It won't be the sole source, but it'll be one of several sources people check out to determine whether or not your organization is a very attractive place to work or whether they should stay away from it. So Wave 3, what did it produce? Well, I think Wave 3 really produced the end of the lifetime employment contract. I think pretty much Wave 2 did all the work it needed to do, and Wave 3 has brought it to an end. You're now really your own brand. So while organizations have brands, people are focused on building up their personal brand ability. Accelerators now have grown for everyone. So many ways to move yourself. There's so many places to build your brand. The rise of the freelance workforce, which really began with subcontracting, Elance, Guru, all these web startups where you can buy specialized talent to do a particular project. And then this is really just a very unusual era where it's no longer Fortune magazine choosing the 10 best places to work. It's literally 700, 1,200 employees rating their organization in public forums. So these 3 waves, if you think about it, have completely eroded the perception, and I'm going to highlight that word, perception, of the need for strong internal talent management. In my point of view, actually they've increased the need for it, but in many ways they have created outsourced talent movers, talent developers, which has caused the ultimate outcome, which I believe are, to some extent, hampered talent management systems that are not able to operate at full capacity. They don't have their full potential. Because ultimately, the accelerators are not going to disappear. As a matter of fact, the accelerators are growing, and the accelerators, for example, talent mobility sources, are now available across the board for different levels. The ability to brand yourself and get public visibility for that have increased. So here's where I think we stand, and then I'd be happy to take some questions. Then I'm going to share with you our conclusions as to what needs to happen. So I think we're in that irreversible shift from lifetime employment. And I say this knowing there are clients and research places where I do research where it's quite the opposite case. These are truly exceptional organizations, and people do want to stay. So there are a few of these places, and they have a remarkable advantage over the rest of the players in a field. And increasingly, I can figure that out using these web-based sources before I join the organization. But that said, younger people really don't trust this notion of lifetime employment. And of course, that means that we don't have to make deep investments in our people because they might turn around and leave us. And that's the biggest fear, that if we make lifetime investments, the people will move. If you look at the amount of money that's spent in many organizations on talent management, leadership development, and it really depends on the company, but I see in some ways shrinking pool of resources. And so you'll remember the outsourcing of HR functions that were literally, we no longer do those internally. I think what has happened as resources have tightened, the focus has zeroed in on high potential talent. And when I think about all the leadership development work I do in organizations, I would have to tell you that about 3/4 of that is focused only on high potential talent. So I see a narrowing focus on this smaller band of individuals. The paradox is, in some ways, we need our talent actually to be much more adept at things like strategic shifts. But again, because we have ways to buy that talent or acquire that talent, there's almost a belief that that's probably the best way to do it, rather than in making a 10-year investment in a younger person in the hopes that they will help us make that shift in the future. So let me see if there are any questions, and if there are, I'll take a few, and then we can head into next steps, recommendations.
Thanks, Jay. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box. The first one from Jim is there a correlation or causation between talent management and company outcomes?
Yes, the opening, and you may not have been there, Jim, for the first slide. There was a Boston Consulting Group study which showed that organizations with strong talent management systems had 2.2 times faster, stronger revenue growth and 1.5 times profitability growth over those who reported weak talent management systems. If you take that study, I think about 1,000 patients. Those are self-reports. Well, self-reports of the strength or weakness of the talent management system, and then BCG benchmarks that historically against their revenue growth and their profitability growth. So that from that one study, there are also 2 or 3 others. I like the BCG study because I think it's a little more rigorous than the others, but the others do show also the same correlation that, generally speaking, yeah, strong talent management, you tend to have better profitability and tend to have better revenue growth.
Thanks, Jay. The next question from Bruce is, have you seen parallel trends in the roles and pay of TD/HR?
Sorry, television, you mean? TV or TM?
TD as in dog, probably talent development, is my guess.
Talent development, okay. Have I seen pay growth?
Right? We've seen parallel trends in the roles and pay of talent development/HR.
That's a great question. I don't have access to that data, so I don't have a point of view about whether, talent management has lessened its role, has pay gone down. I don't know. I'm assuming it has not, thanks to inflation, but I don't have an answer to that.
And then Bruce also asks, are the talent roles changing?
Yes, I think what I see as the biggest shift is that more and more attention is devoted to the high potential talent. And, that more and more of the energy is on that small select group of people. And my experience, most companies define high potential talent as the top 3 to 5% of either expert talent or leadership talent in either a line organization or a functional specialty. So the bulk of it's going to people who are perceived to have the most promise.
Great, and then I also see that Naz has his hand up, so I've unmuted you, so if you have a question, you can go ahead. Are you there, Naz?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, I think I just wanted to know what, therefore, becomes the critical talent needs that an organization can focus on, given that most of it is now being outsourced.
Yes, so that's a great question. It's actually, I'm going to use that now to segue into my recommendations, because you're exactly right. The question now becomes, given the fact that potentially our attention and our money and our time is more narrowed, where should we devote it? And particularly that we've become so reliant upon outsourcing of talent management. So I'll use that to segue into the recommendations. So I think, first of all, one of the classic dilemmas in talent management is a stronger link to the business strategy. This ends up, unfortunately, it ends up rhetorical in the sense that we hear it over and over again, but actually what we saw in the research we did was that still human resources, talent management is still not at the table when it comes to really being included in the implications of business strategy shifts for the talent management equation. So I'm going to have some recommendations in that space. I really do believe that this has to be an imperative, and that the talent management individuals and the HR individuals have to be very good at translating for their organizations talent implications of strategy. I think, again, we want to continue the focus on critical talent roles, but I think we spend not enough on retention and development of those roles. We probably have plenty of attention on assessment and succession. And I think we need to be much more broader in casting our net as to what we mean by critical talent roles. And I'm a big fan. I believe that high potential talent can't just be leadership talent. It also has to be functional and expertise talent, so that we have talent ladders in things like engineering, software design, go down the long list of areas where cybersecurity expertise. These are really pivotal talent roles, and so it's important that we be extremely clear about what we believe to be the most important talent. One of the things which a colleague and friend, Doug Reddy, and I wrote in an article for the Harvard Business Review a number of years ago called Make Your Company a Talent Factory. And in that, we looked at what really distinguished the high-performing talent management organizations. And they did two things really well. One is they integrated their talent management systems so that they were all really well aligned with themselves. So succession with performance management, with coaching and development, training, all tightly aligned around the same types of issues. And we call that high functionality. But the other thing which they did so well was that they had commitment from the executives, commitment from the line management, and commitment from HR that was incredibly committed to talent and talent development. And we call that high vitality. And what we realized is that these organizations had high vitality across all levels. So talent management was not seen as something that was delegated to a department. The CEO felt responsible. The line manager who went out and did college recruiting felt responsible. So we call those high vitality organizations. And I really came away from that project believing that you can't have talent management siloed in a function. I'm going to push this further, but line management has to feel like they get direct value and that they have strong say over shaping the processes of talent management. And as a result, that simplicity characterizes the process. Line managers, as you can appreciate, have so much going on in their world, and increasing their span of control is quite large. So designing systems that are really simple to use, but are highly focused at the same time. And one of the challenges, I think, for all of us in the field of talent management is we appreciate the complexity. We realize how important that is. But increasingly, we have to forego our appreciation for that to really design simple, focused processes that are extremely easy to use. We're in the age of the Amazon one-click. not easy to pull off. So what can you be doing? Well, depending on your role, I think in many ways, look around. Where are your talent issues? Where are you losing people? Where do you not have enough individuals? I think it's really important to build a business case for them. And I've always felt that if you're going to start building stronger appreciation for talent management, you start with the pain points, the places where your organization really currently feels the pain, and you launch initiatives in those areas, pilots, thoughtful experiments, and those then become the foundation points for building a more rigorous talent management system over time. But I think you have to start with the pain points, because that's where the organization will feel the need. Pivotal jobs, I think, are really important in kind of figuring out what are the roles that have important cascading effects. And any of you are in the space of retail, you would appreciate the fact that the retail store manager is a pivotal role. They shape so directly attraction, retention of the store personnel. They're critical. So it's figuring out what are the pivotal roles where we should be investing more time and energy. And then something I mentioned earlier, simplifying your line management processes. But I want to go back to line manager because there are two individuals who primarily deliver the talent management experience. The HR or talent management partner and the boss. In the companies with high vitality, it would include the boss's boss and the boss's boss's boss and the CEO. But in most organizations, it's the line manager and the talent management partner. This is the primary place I think you have to focus, which is really aligning line managers to appreciate talent management. I'll say it a third time, make the process easy for them. Assess and reward them on development skills. Many of you do have development in your performance reviews for line managers, but I'll bet you that those who do not do a good job on this but get results don't feel much of a consequence. So I think it's upping the stakes on this part of the review. Increasingly, I think if we're going to encourage managers to develop their own talent, it's really focusing more on coaching and feedback skills. And I do a lot of executive education, and part of the executive education is focused on giving feedback and coaching. And in a room of 50 people, I'll say, how many of you have had a rigorous coaching program to help you become masterful at coaching? And out of 50, I might have 2 hands go up. So then I say, how many of you have had at least a good coaching development program? I might get 3 more hands. So, I probably see 5,000 managers a year. So 10, 15%. The rest say that they're kind of at the mercy of occasional bosses who are good at this, but they're not as plentiful as one would hope. Engaging your executives. I think one of the things which is so important is finding where talent management in recent years has made a real difference to your firm and sharing those stories with them and sharing the data, again, building your case. I've always found if you can tie talent management directly to their personal agendas. So if one of the executives is building out the digital space in your industry, helping them achieve that with very talented people in the digital arena, making it your job to make that happen for them. Making the process very engaging. Again, I have lots of clients where, I'll ask my line managers, how is your PM process? And they say, well, it's kind of a list building process. And not true for all, but for many it is, and it's not engaging. And then one of the things which Ed Lawler and I found was that CHROs are not in the boardrooms at any kind of degree with which the CFO is. which you could argue is understandable, but oftentimes about 5% of the agenda of a board is devoted to the people issues. I think CHROs have to work harder at bringing talent management into the boardroom and making it increasingly more and more of the discussion, going way beyond CEO and executive succession and compensation. And by the way, those are the two topics that the CHROs tend to focus on: executive compensation and CEO and executive succession. That's about the extent of TM discussions. So if you're an HR leader, well, I think you need to spend a lot more time with your strategists, with your business developers, with your marketeers. I know you have a lot on your agenda. Your days are very busy. But personally, I see the individuals who are very effective in HR at building links to the business strategy. They will meet once a week or twice a week with the people who really are thinking about the marketplace, thinking about strategy. They have the terminology. They're on top of where their business is going. And they're continuing asking, where are the talent implications of this business? As you can appreciate, one of the reasons why the CFO is so influential is because they use a lot of data. And they use terminology that boards and CEOs and executives feel very comfortable with. This is something that John Boudreau has spoken extensively about, but I think it's increasingly important to leverage that kind of structure in your communications. Spend more time networking, being more persuasive. Again, what I said earlier, appreciate the complexity of talent management, but really discipline yourself to keep it as simple as you can. So let me close on a wonderful quote from Warren Buffett, who said, "Someone is sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago." And I think for me, talent management, given the mobility, given the phenomenon of Glassdoor, given the phenomenon of LinkedIn, I think is an imperative, because increasingly it will be the primary way in which you retain your best talent. And what I fear is that the gradual erosion and outsourcing of talent management has weakened our ability to leverage it as an immensely powerful way to retain. So I'm going to close on that note because I think it's our imperative.
Great. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. So I'll actually just work backwards. The first one is from Scott, and he asks, let's see, have had great success bringing high potential talent into the boardroom, so they tell the story of how they experience talent management instead of it coming from HR.
That's fantastic. I love that. That's such a great idea.
Okay, and then next from Nancy, what can organizations do to better the skills of line managers? Many large organizations have leader development and coaching, but seems to be missing the mark.
Yes, I would agree, and I think a large part because it tends to be episodic, and it tends to be built around very short training intervals that tend to be oftentimes one-timers, and then increasingly a lot of it's gone online. So it doesn't demand a lot of work on your part. So I think things like leader development and coaching really require multiple sessions with lots of application and practice, where the individuals are held accountable at time periods after the training. And so I think that's really, we need to move away from short, it's a bit of a paradox. Everybody wants short training programs, partly because no one feels they have the time. They also feel that there isn't a lot of money and we need to reach a lot of people. But I think we're paying a very high price. To develop coaching skills is something that takes several years of really great experimentation and practice. And to turn that into a 2-day or 1-day workshop does not do it justice. I think the other thing, too, is increasingly we need line managers who are really good coachers to act as mentors for individuals who are trying to get more mastery of their coaching skills. So I think it requires a real reinvention of how we think about training.
Great. And then Nancy also asked, what critical skills must the HR talent manager have?
I go back to spend a lot more time with your strategists and with the people who are out in the marketplace and really thinking through for the organization what are the implications of strategic shifts or strategic initiatives or new growth markets. I think also really, I would say talent management people have to really hone their persuasion and communication skills. I mean, you really need to increasingly be world-class at communicating and persuading because you don't have the authority to make things happen. And again, I'd go back to some of the things which John Boudreau has mentioned, which is using the language and also some of the data that other functions use to build their case. I think those are really important. The other thing is, again, I think networking, spending a lot more time networking beyond your colleagues, networking throughout the organization, building strong relationships. I want to thank everybody. Thank you so much. I hope you found it at least provocative. I do feel, again, that the field is ripe for reinvention. And you can begin to appreciate why historically this satisfaction has grown so much because of these three very powerful waves that have been slowly pulling away from companies and organizations, their talent management functions and their value. So I think it's time to reverse the outsourcing and insource. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jay, for a great webinar. And if anyone has any questions that they weren't able to ask, when I send out the link to the recording, you can just send that question to me and I'll get an answer for you. Thanks, Jay. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you, Carrie. Bye-bye.